Hello, welcome to Origin Story for another between-season bonus episode. I'm Dorian Linsky.
And I am Ian Dunt.
So it's quite a big one today. We're telling the story of the Rivers of Blood speech delivered by Conservative MP Enoch Powell on 20th of April 1968. Probably the most explosive speech in British peacetime history, at least during the last 100 years. It is still invoked as toxic by anti-racists and increasingly reanimated by right-wing politicians. But what did Powell say? Why did he say it? And what were the consequences? So, Ian, Rivers of Blood was obviously hugely controversial at the time. But what freaks me out is that people like Robert Jenrick, who before we record has gone even further, has actually gone beyond Powell, I think.
Oh, yeah.
By turning up at a far-right protest. They're basically saying the same thing without any damage to their careers. Quite the opposite, in fact.
There was I think it's a Sam Friedman, health warning on that, but I think it was a Sam Friedman piece recently where he was talking about the difference of the way that the Tory leadership has responded to, for instance, the way that Heath responded to Rivers of Blood, which I think you'll come to, which is basically ostracizing him and, detaching itself from that kind of rhetoric, and the way that the Tory leadership currently behaves when it comes to highly racialized anti-immigration rhetoric, which is just fucking go right ahead, mate.
Say nothing.
Not a problem with us anymore.
No.
So that kind of elite tolerance of this kind of rhetoric we're in a much worse place now than we were all those decades ago.
And yet in a better place with the public.
Yes.
As we'll see from some of these absolutely hair-raising statistics later. So I'm also going to talk a bit about Powell as a character and his influence beyond racism. He's a hugely influential figure in conservative politics in all kinds of ways. A lot of people find him quite a romantic figure because he consistently chose his principles over his career.
Right. Tell me about the principles, really.
Well, one is friends and principles. Two, also he was quite obnoxious and he didn't really get on with people. So it's not as if he had this kind of like brilliant career that he jeopardized just for that. Like there are other reasons why he never became Conservative leader, as we'll see. Now, warning, I'll be using a lot of quotations from Powell and his contemporaries. That obviously includes racist views. There's no like crude racist language, but the views are sometimes grim. So we shall begin, right?
Yeah, we should. I love the way he had to warn that there will be racism in a podcast about Enoch Powell.
I know, but sometimes you find yourself reading something out and you're just like,
I don't want to say this.
So just to start, the warm-up, because I think it's really important to know how he got there. John Enoch Powell, born 16th of June, 1912 in Birmingham, son of a school headmaster. Unbelievably clever and ambitious. Private school, then classics at Trinity College, Cambridge, endless prizes, scholarships, learned more than a dozen languages.
Jesus Christ.
Dropped his first name at Cambridge because there was another classicist called John Powell. That's why we have Enoch Powell. At 25, he becomes professor of Greek at the University of Sydney, the youngest professor in the British Empire. And he loves...
I have no idea about any of this.
Yeah, like a real kind of, meteoric start. Basically, there's up to a point you're just like, he's very impressive, So he's obsessed with Germany, obsessed with German culture. And that's shattered by the rise of Hitler and specifically the Night of the Long Knives. And this is the first of what he describes as a series of sort of his delusions being shattered, which really informs his politics. So he becomes an ardent anti-appeaser, races back to Britain in 1939 to fight in the war, actively hoping to be martyred in battle. Quite weird that he sort of wants to die. He's got a great idea of himself as a great hero. Thus disappointed, he rose to the rank of brigadier via campaigns in North Africa, in India, served under Mountbatten for a bit.
If you write memoirs, you should title them Thus Disappointed.
Thus Disappointed. I mean, it's a shame he didn't die, but he gets an MBE for military service. Now, a major theme of his early life is disillusionment. And he becomes obsessed with dismantling delusions and being a realist as he sees it. So his three core themes, I'd say to bear in mind, are like drama, destiny, and delusion. The 3Ds. And one of his disillusionments was the empire. He dreamt of becoming Viceroy of India. At university, he learnt Urdu specifically to help him become Viceroy of India.
Wow.
A lot of the time we come across these figures and their ambition is just so beyond anything that you've ever encountered in your life, right? Voted Labour in 1945 solely to punish the Tories for appeasement, but then immediately joined the Tory party, specifically in order to ensure the continuance of British rule in India.
Right.
So absolutely devastated when Clement Attlee declares that India will get independence. Not only does it kill his personal ambition of becoming viceroy, but he thinks that without India, the whole empire is doomed, which he's right about.
Yes. Oh, and this comes to mind. Doesn't he spend the sort of the evening after the declaration weeping in Soho or something?
Walking
like
around the streets, very sad.
Right. Okay.
He says
not
it was
quite as dramatic as I've made.
a shattering moment, a shattering undeception. And he once said, I suppose India was my great delusion. I don't know whether he was a crying man.
I see.
But he definitely was very...
he was crying inside.
He was crying inside.
Right.
So what he does, this is really important for his politics, he basically replaces imperialism with nationalism. So Britain needs to accept its diminished status, pull up the drawbridge to protect its national identity, rather than try and sustain its international clout in partnership with other countries, which is a delusion. So he opposes the Commonwealth, the special relationship with America, and eventually European integration.
Oh, he's basically an isolationist. There's an incredible series of logical steps that he's gone through. It's just like, we can't run the world, so we might as well just back the fuck out of it.
He sums this up in 1964. Happiness and success are likeliest to come to the nations which know themselves as they really are without delusions of height or depth. But this realism, as he sees it, is wrapped up in this almost mystical belief in England alone. So there is a great kind of romanticism which tips into sort of, ethno-nationalism later on. But he always presents it as realism.
Such a fascinatingly eccentric bundle of views he's managed to collect there.
But logical in his mind.
Okay, yeah, all right.
Britain alone, that's it. England alone. So in 1950, he becomes MP for Wolverhampton South West. West Midlands Tory says he was an able and hard-working member, but quite inhuman and arrogant in personality, with little or no knowledge of human psychology. His political worth is esteemed in Wolverhampton, but his real friends are few.
that final sentence is quite punishing, really.
There we have it. This will impact his political career, his not having friends. So he becomes a minister. During the 50s, housing, then health, then the Treasury. Now, these days, obviously, we associate him with immigration and racism. But for a long time, his obsession was economics. He belonged to Hayek's Mont Pelerin Society.
Which we have come across before.
Tick Hayek. And he believed in monetarism and privatization and hardline and inflation before most Tories did. He was probably the leading opponent of the post-war consensus. Total proto-Thatcherite. And he actually resigns from the Treasury in 1958 along with the Chancellor because Harold Macmillan blocked a massive package of spending cuts that had been put together by the Institute of Economic Affairs.
Oh, wow.
Which he then, the OG neoliberal think tank, which Powell then becomes very, very close with. So until 1968, if you use the word Powellism or Powellite, you basically meant neoliberal, not racist. And in fact, at this point, he is not talking about race at all. In fact, his most famous speech for Rivers of Blood was one in 1959 where he attacked the massacre of Mau Mau rebels in Kenya and stood up for universal human rights.
Okay.
And so later his defenders would bring up the way that he behaved when he was serving in India to Indians to show that he wasn't a hardcore racist. And it's quite possible that he was not at that point. But things can change. So there are a lot of Tories getting agitated about immigration. There's a British Nationality Act of 1948 defined all Commonwealth citizens as British citizens, therefore gave them freedom of movement. I mean, that hasn't been in place for so long that I think it's quite surprising to learn that there was basically freedom of movement. And the numbers weren't very large. In 1961, Wolverhampton's non-white population was increasing by about 1,000 a year. But it was too much for many Tories. So in 1962, they passed the Commonwealth Immigrants Act, which introduces work permits and cuts immigration by about 2/3. Labour's reaction is pretty hardcore. Leader Hugh Gaitskell calls it cruel and brutal anti-colour legislation. Barbara Castle calls it a violation of the very idea of the Commonwealth.
These were the days.
Yeah, and they didn't last long. It's mainstream Tory policy. So Powell, he's not an outlier. He's not even talking about it publicly. Things changed during the 1964 election campaign. This is the one with the notorious slogan in Smethwick, if you want an N-word for a neighbour, vote Labour. Nothing to do with Powell, but that was this election. Now, he's the only MP to name immigration as the most important issue of Britain. He says, control is essential. I'm convinced that strict control must continue if we are to avoid the evils of a colour question in this country for ourselves and for our children. Now, what he's doing here, and will do in 1968, is he points to racial tension and violence in America as the nightmare scenario and says it will be inevitable here if immigration continues. The logic being, of course, that the way to keep racism out of politics is to keep people of colour out of Britain.
Yes.
And go, if there's only white people, there's not a problem. But he presents it in a sort of humane way.
Yeah.
So he's noticing that the Tory grassroots are moving to the right on immigration. So he's following them, partly for political reasons. But he's fudging it in public. So privately, he uses phrases like our own people and coloured ghettos.
Oh, wow. Okay.
But in a book review in the Sunday Times, he claims to be an integrationist. So his idea is you reduce immigration, possibly to zero, but you integrate those who are already here through the magic of the free market. So money is colourblind, and economic forces will help the work of integration. And he flatly denies racism. I will always set my face like flint against making any difference between one citizen of this country and another on grounds of his origin. This is brought up a lot later on.
As a defense of him?
Well, or an attack on him and go, well, look how he's changed.
Right.
Like, was he bullshitting or has he changed very fast? Because he starts talking about voluntary repatriation for those who are proving unsuccessful or unassimilable.
It is actually starting to kill me how every sentence you say feels like it was taken out of a headline that I read yesterday rather than one that took place 50 years ago.
Oh, there's more. There's more. So this is remigration. He called it re-emigration. Now it's this new buzzword, remigration, but it's essentially the same with an E missing. And in May 1965, the Daily Mail runs a story called Powell's Send Them Home Plan.
Right.
So he's getting known as the Barry Goldwater of British politics, you know, the very hardline American conservative, the spearhead of the new right, still mostly talking about economics rather than immigration, socially liberal in some respects, votes to decriminalise homosexuality and abolish the death penalty, for example.
Oh, really? Huh. It's really quite bizarre.
Yeah. He has a lot of kind of different principles deeply held. They don't all add up to the story of a headbanger. This is not a defense of him. It's just to go that he's an idiosyncratic character. There are much more explicitly racist Tory MPs out there. You know, if you're talking 1964, 65, you would probably have talked about Sir Cyril Osborne of the hard right Monday Club, who claims that Britain is committing race suicide and writes in The Spectator, those who so vehemently denounce the slogan, keep Britain white, should answer the question, do they want it to turn black?
Imagine naming your club after the worst day of the week. I mean, the racism is bad, but it's such an unbelievably. I suppose Tuesday Club would be. I
forget why it's called the Monday Club. It's not because.
Well, presumably because they first met on a Monday. That's usually how these guys do it.
No, I think it's named after something else. It's not because they had a case of the Mondays. But they were he wasn't in the most racist group.
Right.
At this point. Stands for Tory leader in 1965, gets hammered 15 votes to Ted Heath's 150 because he just doesn't have many friends in Westminster. He's a very difficult, aloof, cold man. He becomes Shadow Defence Minister with an agenda to finish unwinding the empire, distance the UK from America, and build a new military alliance with Europe. The first two policies are very power light. The third, less so. Anti-immigration candidates actually do badly in the 1966 election. It's a real issue of the election. A lot of the time when a constituency is fought on that basis, the anti-immigration candidate loses. So New Birmingham MP Brian Walden, I will not do an impression again, says prematurely, we have buried the race issue. But of course, they have not. In February 1967, Powell makes his first major statement on immigration. It's a Telegraph article called Facing Up to Britain's Race Problem. Quite a drastic shift. He's now decided that integration is another delusion. You're an idiot if you believe in integration, as he did 3 years earlier. He calls for virtually terminating net immigration, describing immigration as an invasion. That year it was 50,000 a year. That was what he considered an invasion.
Do we have any evidence as to whether this is coming from a genuine sense of sort of intellectual and political change, or whether it's just exploiting what he sees as a sort of pent-up demand for an strategic?
I think it's both. And I think it may have started as more of a political calculation. But it's clearly heading towards racism. And of course, as we always say, well, the consequences, if you're talking about terminating net immigration, it doesn't really matter why you're saying it. Like with Jenrick, is he doing it out of ambition or because he's a racist?
Yeah.
It doesn't really matter. It really doesn't matter. But you can certainly see a big change during the 60s. He follows up with a Sunday Express article in July, Can we afford to let our race problem explode? If you persist in asserting what is an undeniable truth, you will be hounded and pilloried as a racialist. This is like the bigot's charter.
Yes, it is.
Not just on race, on all kinds of bigotries. I am simply stating a fact, and yet I am being called a bigot. How outrageous. So far, what he's doing is, it's all in newspapers, not speeches. He visits America for the first time that year, where he is absolutely terrified by cities like New York.
Right.
Now, to be fair, they were. This was not a high point for the city of New York and kind of, safety in urban America, right? There were high crime rates. He obviously sees it purely through a racial lens. He says privately, it's quite extraordinary. Integration of races of totally disparate origins and culture is one of the great myths of our time. It has never worked throughout history. The United States lost its only real opportunity of solving its racial problem when it failed after the Civil War to partition the old Confederacy into a South Africa and a Liberia.
Wow, what the fuck?
So I haven't even heard this from like the new right, far right now, the idea that it should have been partitioned into ethno-states after the Civil War. This is in private. But the fact that he's saying in private suggests that this is not just calculation.
No. He also, I've got to say, from the little I've heard about him, that it doesn't sound like the kind of person that makes these particularly cold calculations. He sounds more like someone that is motivated by his own sense of what he thinks is correct.
But of course, what we would now call this is radicalization.
Yeah. You've just outlined a radicalization pathway.
Exactly, a radicalization pathway, which we see being taken a lot these days. So immigration becomes a massive issue in British politics for the first time because of Kenyan independence. Basically, when Kenya became independent in 1963, Britain made an exemption to that 1962 Act I talked about, so that white Kenyans could retain their UK citizenship. But 100,000 Kenyan Asians also took advantage of this scheme and retained citizenship. So when Kenya's Africanization initiative, which is very hostile to Asians living there, made them unwelcome, many of them planned to move to the UK, including Rishi Sunak's parents. Now, the thing is, and I read an article in the Times where it was basically just going, oh yeah, what they should have done is specified white people.
Yeah,
great. They go, basically, it was meant for white people, but they couldn't say it out loud, therefore unintended consequences. Now, Duncan Sandys, the shadow colonial and Commonwealth secretary, Winston Churchill's son-in-law, leads a campaign to close this loophole. Now, this seems very weird now. He was both an ardent Europhile, co-founder of the European movement, and a massive racist.
Right. So we're not going to claim him for our Remain posters.
No. I mean, I don't know how the European movement deals with him. But the Kenyan issue becomes explosive. Now, around this time, Powell identifies two more useful enemies. One is Home Secretary Roy Jenkins' Race Relations Bill, which will expand the 1965 Race Relations Act to outlaw discrimination in housing and employment. He's already outlawed racist hate speech. The other is the Tory shadow Home Secretary Quintin Hogg, who he thinks is complacent and soft and supports the bill. So it's like, oh, well, there's no alternative here. Right? So he makes his move with a speech in Walsall on the 9th of February, which is a kind of dry run for Rivers of Blood. Now, usually he's quite a cold theoretical speaker, but not here. He's changed up. So there's certain tricks he's trying. He twists statistics to predict the highest possible immigration numbers. And he uses an emotive anecdote. He mentions a letter from a constituent whose daughter was being bullied because she was the only white child in her primary school.
Oh, fuck me.
So journalists look into this, discover there was one small class in one school where on one day, due to illness and absenteeism, there was only one white child.
These people, I swear to fucking God, it's like they don't change their tactics over the fact, like nothing changes.
They do not at all. And he uses hyperbolic language. Immigration is crazy and incredible and stark staring bonkers. Like, this is kind of the recipe that he's preparing. Now, obviously, the Walsall speech gets overshadowed by Rivers of Blood. But at the time, it's a pretty big deal. The Sunday Times, and this is a very good episode for the Times and the Sunday Times, I've got to say. And none other than liberal William Rees-Mogg,
Jesus.
Who proves himself to be absolutely staunch on this.
Right.
So he runs an editorial, the Sunday Times, runs an editorial called Powell and Prejudice. It says his unreliable statistical projections and tones of lurid menace are irresponsible. Students demonstrate against his appearance at the University of Essex Conservative Association. One even sends in a bomb threat. This is sort of the beginning of student activism, as we know, something 1968. So there's a lot else going on around the world, Paris and so on. Even Powell's friends at the IEA complain that his anti-immigration obsession is inconsistent with his economic liberalism, which you don't hear so much now. But I mean, there are still some ultra-principled neoliberals who go, you shouldn't be anti-immigration.
Yeah, I know a couple of them. People that work for those organizations or for the Spectator.
Yeah.
And there aren't many, you're right, but you notice them when they're there and they're also liberal on drugs policy and on immigration. And you're like, okay, great, we disagree, but you're consistent as opposed to the usual crap.
They're useful to have. The speech does help move the needle on the Kenya issue. So Labour Home Secretary James Callaghan, who has replaced the more liberal Roy Jenkins, rushes through the Commonwealth Immigrants Act, 1968, in just 3 weeks, passes the Commons in 3 days. It's a complete U-turn from Labour since the 1962 Act. All that stuff that Gateskill and Castle were saying no longer applies. Now restrictions are good. Cabinet papers released 30 years later revealed in minutes of meetings that it was specifically aimed at, quote, coloured immigrants.
Oh, Jesus.
So people who are shocked and rightly disgusted by some of Starmer's rhetoric on immigration should know that Labour were doing this in 1968, basically to diffuse this issue of Kenyan Asian immigrants. The writer Paul Foot, people know him like the Full Foot Award, Private Eye, and a great track record.
Campaigning socialist journalist.
Yes. Better description. Well done. Thank you. He wrote a book about Powell, which is very good. He made a timeless observation. One of the most constant rules in the history of immigration control is that those demanding controls are encouraged, not silenced, by concessions.
Fuck me, we'll never learn.
Foot pointed out that as Powell's career went on, his emphasis on immigration went up and down according not to the numbers of immigrants, but to its salience with voters. Reducing the numbers was absolutely irrelevant to his message. It was a vibes-based thing. Powell's biographer, Andrew Roth, writes, he now had a formula. Mix a genuine regional grievance, I maybe question genuine, with dramatic personal examples of the way in which it operates, launch it from own safe home territory, and watch its impact in forcing the liberal left of the party to run for cover. And indeed, the liberal left of the country, one could argue. So, Powell wanted to do it again, but bigger. So, in an unfortunate coincidence, Saturday, 20th of April would have been Hitler's 79th birthday. But that's not, to his credit, why Powell chose the date.
Is that the one piece of credit you can give him?
Yeah, nor is it because it would later become slang for weed. That's neither of those things. 3 reasons. Most obviously, it was the annual general meeting of the West Midlands Area Conservative Political Centre at the Midland Hotel in Birmingham, right? So Powell would always call this the Birmingham speech.
Right.
And for some reason took exception to the Rivers of Blood label.
I mean, journalistically, he really should be able to appreciate that one is far superior to the other.
Yeah. This episode is not called the Birmingham speech. Secondly, the Race Relations Bill had been published on 8th of April, was due its second reading on Tuesday the 23rd, 3 days later. Thirdly, as regular listeners will know, and Ian talked about, Martin Luther King's assassination on the 4th of April had triggered massive unrest in American cities, giving Powell some ammunition for his predictions of race war. Fourthly, Saturday was the best day for a speech because it guaranteed coverage in the Sunday and Monday papers. And this is crucial. This is not one of those cases where a speech to a specific audience gets picked up and taken out of context. Powell planned it like a military campaign because Walsall did not get the attention he wanted. He told a journalist friend a few days earlier, I'm going to make a speech at the weekend and it's going to go up fizz like a rocket. But whereas all rockets fall to the earth, this one is going to stay up. He didn't inform Ted Heath in advance, but he did send copies of the speech to local newspapers, national newspapers, and TV stations, one of which ATV sent cameras to film it. I mean, it's amazing this didn't get back to Ted Heath somehow, considering every journalist in the country seemed to know the speech like word for word in advance.
I mean, I quite like Ted Heath, but that specific fact doesn't necessarily surprise me.
Right. So I'm going to break it down, which is a typical mix of dodgy statistics, dodgier anecdotes, and doomer oratory. Like, people will know the speech, but I think it's really important to just kind of know it in detail, right?
Great. Now I can't wait to spend the next 45 minutes of my life sat here having a point-by-point breakdown of Rivers of Blood.
And bear in mind that I do not have his terrifying oratorical skills and his kind of cold staring eyes and very, very precise diction.
Yeah, it's like watching fucking Jaws or something, these cold, dead doll's eyes that he's got.
And some sort of militaristic manner that he has. My eyes are lovely. So first he presents himself as a good local MP, giving a voice to voiceless constituents, even though, as Paul points out, he wasn't usually interested in local issues and immigration wasn't a massive issue in Wolverhampton. He quotes what he calls a decent, ordinary fellow Englishman, saying he would leave the country because, quote, in this country in 15 or 20 years' time, the black man will have the whip hand over the white man. Now later he will protest that these aren't his words, they're the words of some guy.
Oh, no.
And he really hates it when people go, because a lot of people say Powell predicted and they'll use the whip hand.
Right.
And Powell's defenders will go, no, it wasn't his words. And it goes, he did choose to quote them, though.
Yeah.
And also, we don't know who this guy is. So they're effectively his words. Like if I hear a racist and then I get up and I quote, this guy said to me, and I quote it approvingly, like, what's the difference?
I mean, especially in a speech that you've notified all the journalists about that you really want to fizz up into the stratosphere.
Every word's chosen, right? Then, immediately, he anticipates an outrage, accusations of racism. How dare I stir up trouble and inflame feelings by repeating such a conversation? The answer is that I do not have the right not to do so. What he is saying, this some guy, thousands and hundreds of thousands are saying and thinking. So the classic, like, I'm saying what everyone's thinking.
Sure.
Now he moves on to the figures. He predicts 3.5 million Commonwealth immigrants by the mid-1980s, 5 to 7 million by 2000. Now, by this, he includes their children and grandchildren. So he doesn't mean immigrants. He means people who aren't white.
Yeah.
Now, what he was doing, he was working from an estimate given by a minister about a year earlier, which is the highest possible estimate based on extrapolation of like nothing changing. That had actually since been reduced. But then he takes the highest possible figure from that. And he suggests that despite using and abusing a figure from a government minister, the truth has been hidden from us. Now he starts his sort of apocalyptic build-up. It is like watching a nation busily engaged in heaping up its own funeral pyre. So what is the solution? Stopping further inflow and promoting the maximum outflow, i.e. remigration. That's the immigration bit. Now he turns to sort of what is underpinning this whole speech, which is the Race Relations Act, which he says would risk throwing a match onto gunpowder because the real victims of discrimination are white people.
So what you're saying is like the country's like some kind of tinderbox.
Tinderbox.
Yeah.
A politician of today might say tinderbox. Now, Quintin Hogg later quipped that if the situation really was gunpowder, it might be thought a little careless to go about with a lighted cigarette in one's mouth, flicking the ash all over the place. Powell then says that white people will become strangers in their own country. Now, I had just today somebody on Blue Sky talking about Starmer's Rivers of Blood speech because of his use of the phrase island of strangers,
Right.
which shows how much the Rivers of Blood speech, certain phrases, are embedded in the historical consciousness.
Yeah.
Like the word strangers almost like sets off an alarm.
My gran, Cockney, she had like maybe 5. All her memories that she remembered of the news were the key sort of moments in the 20th century. It's like the abdication, the Chamberlain speech, Peace in Our Time, and this speech, which she loved.
Right.
She absolutely fucking loved this speech.
Oh.
And it was, yeah, no, she
This is a lovely story. No, it's not. Okay.
Yeah, she wouldn't necessarily have been classic, demographic for origin story. She was still around. But like it permeated. I would say that for her, this is someone who went through World War II. It was one of the sort of 5 news events that fully permeated her consciousness. She would repeat over and over and was still repeating in the 1990s when I was a kid listening to it.
Now, this is why when Starmer talks about an island of strangers, which is everybody feeling more alienated, that is not the same as saying that white people will be strangers in their own country. It's not the same at all. And yet, you should know if you're making a speech on immigration, you should reread the Rivers of Blood speech and go, are there any key words here that echo this? Because it was bound to get that reaction. I think it was an overreaction to say that his speech was essentially the same as Powell's.
Well, it just seemed to be, I mean, his speech
careless.
was absolutely terrible in its reasoning and its rhetoric. And the least of the problems seemed to me the fact that there might, if you really tried to find it, be an echo of power, because it just clearly wasn't intended. Whereas what really was intended was a series of vicious slurs against immigrants and a whipping up of conspiracy theories around the idea of the border. So it just seemed like the wrong thing to be getting cross with. But I wasn't particularly in the mood to co-defend him, because you're just like, he is a correct person to be crossed with right now.
The speech stank, but I thought the overreaction, I think, is that particular phrase speaks to kind of the influence of Rivers of Blood and how much everybody sort of knows it.
Yes, that's right.
But just think about that. He is claiming that in Britain in 1968, it is much easier to be black than to be white. So what evidence does he have? Well, he's got one letter about an old white woman in Wolverhampton who refuses to let rooms to people of colour and is called a racialist. And this is a bit confusing because people of colour is not a phrase he would have used and racialist is not a phrase we would use. So that's in quotes. He reads out, "She is becoming afraid to go out. Windows are broken. She finds excreta pushed through her letterbox. When she goes to the shops, she is followed by children," racist language coming in, "charming, wide-grinning pickaninnies." Now, this, of course, is why Boris Johnson's use of that word in 2002, which he said was satirical, blah, 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 was so inflammatory. He was like, I was sort of satirically mocking old school racism. But again, that word, it sets off the Rivers of Blood alarm in the consciousness. Also, I think he was being kind of racist. He goes on, Powell, not Johnson. "They cannot speak English, but one word they know, racialist, they chant. When the new race relations bill is passed, this woman is convinced she will go to prison. And is she so wrong? I begin to wonder."
God, this speech just is absolute fucking poison, isn't it? I mean, even coming from you know what it is. It's just every fucking second of it is just dripping with venom.
Now, by his own admission, she refuses. She will only let rooms to white people, and the new act will outlaw racial discrimination in housing. Right? So, yes, she would be breaking that law. He thinks that would be a bad thing.
Also, she is clearly a racist.
Well, okay. Does she exist? So, right. Because obviously, it is implausible that children from English-speaking Commonwealth families would not be able to speak English. Why are these kids unable to speak English apart from one word, racialist? Like, that doesn't make any sense because it's in the Commonwealth. Later, no journalist was able to track her down. And Powell refused to give her name for privacy reasons. Plus, it wasn't a letter from her, it was a letter from somebody else, some guy, about her.
Right.
In 2007, the BBC claimed to have identified her. But then someone else interviewed this woman's former neighbours. They insisted that unlike the woman in the letter, she didn't receive any abuse and she didn't have children. So my gut feeling is that even if this woman did exist, the details were exaggerated or invented. Like that thing about not being able to speak English is clearly bollocks. Roy Jenkins said the anecdote reminded him of sort of unsourced Nazi propaganda about crimes by Jews.
Yeah.
The vicious, unreliable anecdote was a huge part of anti-Semitic propaganda, obviously. This anecdote, almost on its own, leads Powell to say that integration is basically impossible on a large scale, so forget about it.
How fucking scientific.
I mean, that seems to be it. This cues up the most famous passage. As you pointed out in the Martin Luther King episode, the aftermath of his assassination is the context for the ominous violence of this passage. So always the classicist, Powell alludes to Virgil's Aeneid. Virgil is the Roman. Powell later said his only regret about the speech was that he didn't quote Virgil in the original Latin and make it clear that it was a quotation.
You know what? I regret that too, because I don't think that would have had the legs that it had in English.
No, and the rest of the speech was fine. But it's like the Whipham quote. Okay, they might not be his words, but he chose to use them. You can't just do that. If I quote from Mein Kampf in German and I go, it's clearly a quote. Like, how do you think words work? Okay, here we go. I'm going to do Powell, but in a very humdrum, flat way. As I look ahead, I am filled with foreboding. Like the Roman, I seem to see the river Tiber foaming with much blood. That tragic and intractable phenomenon which we watch with horror on the other side of the Atlantic, i.e. the violence following King's assassination, but which there is interwoven with the history and existence of the states itself, slavery, is coming upon us here by our own volition and our own neglect. Indeed, it has all but come. In numerical terms, it will be of American proportions long before the end of the 20th century. Subs to check. Only resolute and urgent action will avert it even now. The apocalyptic call for arms. Disaster is imminent. In fact, it's basically upon us. But if we act decisively now, we can prevent it. Whether there will be the public will to demand and obtain that action, I do not know. Again, the apocalyptic prophet. Are you ready? Are you ready to do what is necessary? Or are you complacent and in denial? All I know is that to see and not to speak would be the great betrayal. Don't shoot the messenger, Gov. You know, it's my moral duty. Like, it's an amazing piece of rhetoric, like the way that it is structured, because of course he's a classicist and he studied the way that these speeches work. And that's why I wanted to kind of break it down.
But also by framing it in the classics, it has that sense of kind of learned respectability to it.
Oh,
you know,
not gutter racism.
Yeah, in the same way that, you know, Churchill used to be able to utilize that stuff for his own rather better arguments. You know, you see it there. It's just like, this is not street thuggery or neo-Nazi skinhead. You know, this is someone who can talk about the River Tiber, and therefore we're dealing with a far higher class of racists than the one that we would normally.
Yeah. But of course, when we strip it all down, the message integration is impossible. Britain is turning into America. Urgent action is required to prevent violence, and he has a moral duty to speak out as a kind of safety valve for the unheard, like the whip hand guy.
Yeah.
It would be terrible if nobody heard from him. So Powell sits down at the end thinking he's done very well. Reportedly, only one person in the room was audibly bothered by the speech, made any kind of protest. But as one Wolverhampton resident said later, until then, we'd only been known for our football team. Overnight, we seem to become a synonym for racialism.
Oh, poor guys.
For Wolverhampton. The next morning, Sunday, the speech appears in all the papers, of course, because it's been sent out in advance, and the shit hits the fan. Powell goes to church as usual, where hilariously he discovers that the rector is that afternoon going to do a memorial service for Martin Luther King. And as he leaves the service, he's confronted by reporters. And he goes, "Have I really caused such a furore?" Powell's argument was that he was only reflecting party policy, right? Because party policy was limiting immigration to Britain, equal treatment for everyone in the country once they're there, which I don't think springs out of that speech, to be honest, and financial help for those who wish to return to their countries of origin. That was policy. That there was a policy of voluntary repatriation. But of course, that's not all he was doing in the speech at all. But he sort of thinks that it's hard to tell if he's disingenuous or deluded, right? A lot of people assumed at the time he was trying to get sacked from the shadow cabinet so he could be a leadership contender on the backbenches. Does this remind you of anyone today? But he genuinely believed he would not be sacked. He did an interview with the Sunday Times after Walsall, before Birmingham. He said, and he shows off basically how he does it. He goes, "I deliberately include at least one startling assertion in every speech in order to attract enough attention to give me a real power base within the Conservative Party. Provided I keep this going, Ted Heath can never sack me from the shadow cabinet."
Oh, interesting.
Like he just said it out loud.
Yeah.
In fact, Heath was furious. Firstly, he had not been warned about it. Secondly, it was a direct challenge to the Tory support for the Race Relation Bill, therefore his authority. If Powell stayed, it was very clear that Quintin Hogg would resign, as would Ian MacLeod, the Shadow Chancellor, and several others.
Right.
Basically, all the kind of more moderate Tories would be gone. So Heath rings around the shadow cabinet to get their support. I'm not sure if it was the only person who wavered, but infamously Margaret Thatcher said he should let Powell stay, just let things cool down. She said in her memoirs that Powell was not a racist and his sacking was a tragedy.
Showing her acute political judgment once again.
I mean, she was not, particularly far right. She wasn't far right. She wasn't particularly racist at this point, but already she's just like, she's going, "Let him stay. It's cool." So Heath obviously has a political reason to get rid of Powell, but he's also personally horrified by Powell's words. We've got to give him some credit there.
Yes.
He pulls the trigger and he says in a statement the speech was racialist in tone and liable to exacerbate racial tensions. Like something you can't imagine Kemi Badenoch saying about Robert Jenrick, right?
And this stuff matters so intently. I sort of think the older you get, the simpler things become in terms of demonstration of norms through leadership. You know, just it's really rudimentary, but it fucking matters. And if the leader isn't prepared to show it, then you are obviously going to find yourself very quickly in a moral abyss, as is demonstrated right now on the pages of the newspapers.
Why is everybody better in the 60s? Basically.
Exactly.
There's no reason for this. The Liberal leader Jeremy Thorpe suggests that Powell could actually be prosecuted under the 1965 Race Relations Act.
Oh, right.
And the Attorney General looks into it, but decides against it. A little later, Prime Minister Harold Wilson weighs in with, I think, a fucking banger, if I may. I prefer reading this out to Powell's words. I am not prepared to stand aside and see this country engulfed by the racial conflict which calculating orators or ignorant prejudice can create, nor in the great world confrontation on race and colour, where this country must declare where it stands, am I prepared to be a neutral. For in the world of today, while political isolationism invites danger and economic isolationism invites bankruptcy, moral isolationism invites contempt.
Well, very good. Wouldn't mind a bit of that right now.
Can you imagine Starmer doing that? So with the exception of the News and the World and the Telegraph, the press is savage, especially the Times under William Rees-Mogg. It runs an editorial on Monday titled An Evil Speech. I'm sorry, this is another long quote, but I think this is important just to let you know what the paper of the establishment is saying.
Also, we've slagged off William Rees-Mogg in so many episodes, from BBC to, I think, the neoliberal episode. He comes up and every time he's an absolute twat. And so it's quite refreshing to find him come up, you know, in such a sort of like virtuous role.
He was, at this point, a very socially liberal editor. His speech was disgraceful because it was racialist. That is, because it was calculated to inflame hatred between the races. The language, the innuendos, the constant appeals to self-pity, the anecdotes, all combined to make a deliberate appeal to racial prejudice. I mean, that just sums up what I spent 10 minutes summing up, right? This is the first time that a serious British politician has appealed to racial hatred in this direct way in our post-war history. It occurred within a couple of weeks of the murder of Martin Luther King and the burning in many American cities. It is almost unbelievable that any man should be so irresponsible as to promote hatred in the face of these examples of the results that can follow. Mr. Powell made an evil speech. It had to be repudiated, and he had to be repudiated with it. The Times really gets on the case with this. Other stories compare him to Oswald Mosley and the neo-Nazi Colin Jordan. In fact, Mosley pops up and accuses Powell of copying him. He goes, I was saying this ages ago. As does A.K. Chesterton of the National Front. What Mr. Powell has said does not vary at all from our views. It is impossible to assimilate people of such differing racial stocks, right? So he's got the NF on his side. Interestingly, American newspapers, from what I could tell from search of the archives, they're the first to call it the Rivers of Blood speech.
Oh, interesting. Probably
because there was a recent bestseller about the Watts riots called Rivers of Blood, Years of Darkness. So again, there's that connection to the kind of racial unrest in America. So they immediately, almost the day after, they were referring to the Rivers of Blood speech. And the only other place that this phrase had appeared is in the title of that book. Then the Guardian Observer start using that name. A few months later, the Times, it catches on.
Interesting.
So there's such an American context to this speech and to the reaction to it. Powell needs weeks of police protection. Public appearances are cancelled, interrupted or moved by protesters. He becomes a free speech martyr. If you look at some of the photos, they'll have, don't knock Enoch and all that lot, and free speech.
Oh, wow.
This is Britain in 1968. Basically, the establishment...
Thank you for reminding me, because for a moment it was actually quite hard to remember.
Yeah. The establishment denounces Powell's racism, with a couple of exceptions. The public loves it. On Tuesday, the 23rd, as the Race Relations Bill is being debated in the Commons, 1,000 dock workers march on Westminster with placards, Don't Knock Enoch and Back Britain, Not Black Britain. Thousands of dockers around the country go on strike in solidarity. Many other trade unionists show similar support. One strike leader tells the press, Mr. Powell spoke his mind. He spoke for all of us. He made me feel proud to be British. We must remember this idea that we have that somehow... the working class or the trade union movement or Labour voters are inherently less racist is not true. In fact, they were kind of like the loudest voices, at least out on the streets.
Yeah.
By Wednesday, Powell has received 20,000 letters of support. Within a week, that's 100,000. Sentiments like, thank God I found someone that has spoken for the white people of England. Good luck, sir, in your efforts to save the country. And this is as important as Dunkirk. Now, these people are not going, perhaps we need more controls on immigration. It is very much white Britain. On Friday, Powell flies to an economics conference in Canada. At Heathrow, 100 workers see him off with a chant of good old Enoch.
Jesus.
And this isn't a loud minority. In a Gallup poll, Powell has 74% approval with only 15% against.
Fuck me.
A similar number think it was wrong to sack him. 97% of letters to the Telegraph favour him. I mean, you expect the Telegraph.
Yeah.
Now, the clear favourite to replace Heath as leader, up from 1% to 24%. But it's all because of immigration, not his beloved neoliberal economics, which the dock workers are not interested in. Worse, it affects how people feel about the race relations bill. In 2 Gallup polls at the beginning and end of April, support for the bill flips from 42-29 in favour to 46-30 against.
Gosh.
So The Spectator says the gap between the conventional wisdom of consensus politicians and the attitudes of the massive voters has become too wide. But Powell himself seems to have made Britain more racist. And I think this is what people sometimes get wrong. Sometimes people go, well, at least they're out in the open. And it's like, no, because racism is latent in a lot of people. And it's important. Progress is made when it is not out in the open, not when it is being eradicated from people's hearts. You know, what he did was he basically activated it and licensed people to be racist.
And provided an indication of social norms.
Yeah.
You can say it too, mate. You know what I mean? Like, you can say it out loud.
It's in the speech, isn't it?
That battle that comes afterwards, the sacking, then when you look at the polling, that's a battle over norms. It's not really a moral battle. It's a battle over what you can say. And the less you're able to say that stuff, the less it thrives, the less it survives, the less it's believed in the heart in the long run. Yeah. That's how you fight the battle for the heart, by what is said by the mouth.
Well, as an example, in February 1968, a poll of issues among Conservative voters, the issues that mattered, immigration wasn't even asked about. A year later, it wasn't the top issue, but it was mentioned by more respondents than any other. And of course, the speech makes life difficult for people who aren't white. Times reports an Indian student is beaten up by white men shouting, "We want Enoch." A West Indian family at a christening party in Wolverhampton are attacked with knives by a gang of youths chanting Powell. One victim said, "I've been here since 1955 and nothing like this has happened before. I am shattered." The High Commissioner for Kenya is booed by Powell supporters when going into the House of Commons for the second reading debate.
Jesus Christ.
And he tells the press, "My driver, who is Kenyan, was shouted at and told to go back to Jamaica." Now, the evidence of racist incidents is more anecdotal than statistical. It's a bit surprising, like, how hard it is to get, like, the hard facts on this. In a December poll, only 8% of non-white Britons said they've been treated worse since the speech.
Okay.
And actually 47% favoured more immigration controls themselves.
Sure.
But many people reported being spat at, abused and threatened, and many more were scared. It was and that was almost like the long tail of it. It's like, sure, you would like to think that most people were not being attacked in the street in the immediate aftermath. But they were scared. In a 40th anniversary piece for The Observer, Sarfraz Mansour wrote, "Powell's name was regularly cited whenever my father wanted to remind me how easily Britain could turn against us." There's a lot of anecdotes. David Onshoga talks about this. Like, the memories of the Rivers of Blood speech are incredibly strong.
Right.
So this percent or that percent really doesn't tell you about the effect that it had. And where the figures do tell us something, membership of the National Front boomed. One organiser told The Times, "Before Powell spoke, we were getting only cranks and perverts." Amazing way to speak about your membership. After his speeches, we started to attract, in a secret sort of way, the right-wing members of Tory organisations.
I'm also just trying to figure out the attraction to perverts of the National Front. Like, what are the opportunities? It's not like the Catholic Church where you can see, So what exactly are the opportunities for you here with a bunch of angry skinheads?
I just learned the idea that you're a National Front organiser. You're talking to the most read paper in the paper of record, and you describe your base as cranks and perverts. Fucking incredible. In his book, Paul Foot shows that Powell was echoing things said by the BNP in Moseley 5 years earlier, when they were utterly beyond the pale for Tories. It was the singular achievement of Enoch Powell to bring these formerly boycotted and discredited arguments out of the murky backwaters of extremism into the mainstream of British politics. And in doing so, Powell makes himself the most talked about politician in the land. Now, I didn't realise how long this lasted. Like, the shockwaves roll on into the autumn. At the Labour conference, Wilson denounces the virus of Powellism. At the Tory conference, there are 80 anti-immigration resolutions, 4 times more than the previous year. And Heath promises more immigration controls. But that's not enough for Powell, obviously, because now he insists on repatriation. You know, you give them an inch, they want more.
Yeah.
In a panorama poll at the end of 1968, 72% favour voluntary remigration and 35% compulsory. This is the public. So 1 in 3 Britons support forced deportations. So Powell makes another speech in Eastbourne on the 16th of November. And it's sort of like, it's quite meta because he's commenting on the previous one, classic populist victimhood. He says that elites like William Rees-Mogg don't know what it's like to live in areas with immigrants and have forced a multiracial society on ordinary, decent Brits. And complains, I have been the target of endless abuse and vilification. No imputation or innuendo has been too vile or scurrilous for supposedly reputable journals to invent or repeat.
This godforsaken crybaby. On the incredible thing is, it's just that what's extraordinary is, you know, if you know any immigrants whose families came in this period, like especially Asians who came in the 70s, the experience of what it was like, the fucking fear,
Extremity of racism,
the violence, the hatred they lived in, to a very significant extent as a result of what this man did. To hear him weeping his little tears about someone calling him a is an extraordinary fucking thing.
Because, on the other hand, I've been borne up by an astonishing manifestation of among all classes of people from all areas of the community expressing relief and gratitude that the speech was made. The sad fact is it was. There is a study, which I'm going to come to later, a really interesting book, studying support for Powell. It basically was consistent across society. The percentage of Powellites in trade unions was the same as the percentage of British people in trade unions.
Oh, right.
They mapped on.
Right.
So it was, unfortunately, across society. He sort of slips up by equating Englishness with ethnicity rather than citizenship. He
Something
says,
that no one, of course, would make the mistake of doing now.
no, that's taboo. The West Indian or Asian does not, by being born in England, become an Englishman. In law, he becomes a United Kingdom citizen by birth. In fact, he is a West Indian or an Asian still, right? This distinction between the UK and England, very common now. This idea that even if you were born here, you're not really... you're not really English. And Paul Foot digs up a quote from an anti-Semitic Tory MP from 1902, which says, the Jew does not, by being born in England, become an Englishman. He is a Jew still. So Paul Foot himself is finding these echoes from earlier racism. This does sound like radicalization. It may have started as opportunism, used immigration to improve his political career. Now he is just a racist. Outrage again. Heath compares it to Nazism. Harold Wilson calls it utterly evil. Even the Telegraph and the Express turn against him. And public support plunges to 58%.
But it's interesting I accept it, it's very high, but there is actually quite a significant, because, like a sort of 20, 30-point drop, really. And
yeah, I mean, he sort of crosses a line, nonetheless. He's still going.
It's so weird, I think, from the perspective of thinking, like, there was a line beyond the rivers of blood point.
There was.
Like, oh, apparently there is. Okay, right. And some people do find it.
And they're all being crossed now by Tories. In January 1969, Powell gives an incredibly disingenuous and fractious TV interview to David Frost. I'm going to pick out a couple of things which are really important here, just to get how slippery he was. Asked if he was a racist, he replied, it depends on how you define the word racialist. If you mean being conscious of the differences between men and nations, and from that racist, then we are all racialists. However, if you mean a man who despises a human being because he belongs to another race, or a man who believes that one race is inherently superior to another, then the answer is emphatically no. So what he was saying, and I believe that he was not a Nazi-style biological racist. But do you know what I mean? He uses sophistry. People accuse him of being a Nazi. He goes, I fought the Nazis, et cetera, et cetera. And when Frost asks him to denounce racist assaults done in his name, he repeatedly refuses. I'm not going to be put in the absurd position of disassociating myself from people with whom you know perfectly well I am in no way associated. So completely hands off. Like, it's not my fault people are being stabbed by people shouting my name.
Yeah.
I didn't ask them to do it.
Yes.
The interview, I found this really interesting. I'd never realized this. The interview was broadcast on the 3rd of January, and Paul McCartney probably saw it because 4 days later, he improvises satirical anti-Enoch lyrics while writing Get Back. Oh, People may know there's a version of Get Back, which is done in like the voice of Enoch Powell, where Get Back means, repatriation. And it's come so soon after this interview, and I'm sure that's why. It's a little Beatles fact for everyone.
Thank you. Yeah, I wasn't expecting that. That came out of left field.
In February 1969, despite all the criticism, Gallup finds that Powell is the most admired person in Britain.
Aye.
Soon he is calling for the setting up of an official Ministry of Repatriation. In a January 1970 speech to young Conservatives in Scarborough, he calls for the complete withdrawal of investment in integration. Remember, he used to be pro-integration. Now he just says, give up. Heath responds, it is an example of man's inhumanity to man, which is absolutely intolerable in a Christian civilized society. Wilson, again, utterly evil. I mean, they're not fucking about. Like, nobody calls far-right politics evil now, right? I mean, not nobody, politicians. During the 1970 election, Powell gets as much coverage as the party leaders and sometimes more. So when Heath wins, which was a bit of a surprise, Powell claims that it's because of him. And he might be kind of right that anti-immigration sentiment probably did help.
Right.
But it bites him on the arse because it kills his leadership hopes. If Heath had lost, he would have been front runner. Heath wins.
Yeah, good point.
That's it. Yeah. So that's the end of that. Nonetheless, Heath introduces another Commonwealth Immigrants Act, which takes up some of the restrictions, that Powell would have liked. And in 1972, Powell wins a Man of the Year poll on Radio 4.
Ooh.
On it goes. Doesn't really start to run out of steam until about 1973. So I just want to talk about Powell as a prototype of the populist politician, right? We've obviously seen, attentive listeners will have noticed a few similarities here. So in 1977, a young American pollster called Douglas Schern, who later became a consultant for Bill and Hillary Clinton, is still around, published a fascinating book called Enoch Powell and the Powellites. And what Schern tried to explain was who was supporting Powell. It obviously wasn't just from the far right. It was, as I said, across all demographics. And he writes, he did not so much as steal an audience from his rivals as attract one which had already become disillusioned with them. In 1964, and the similarities actually blew my mind here. In 1964, Labour won the lowest vote share of a majority government since 1922 and was said to have a weak mandate. In 1966, according to David Butler and Anthony King, they wrote a book about every election, the Labour victory should probably be attributed more to dissatisfaction with the Tories than to any measure of confidence in Labour's ability to govern. There was falling turnout, especially in Labour areas, and a more volatile electorate. 45% switched parties between 1969 and 1970. That's crazy, actually. That's crazy. The greatest movement from Labour to the Tories was among C2 skilled manual workers.
Right.
I mean, all of this applies now, right?
Yeah. This is the story we've been telling ourselves for the last 10 years.
2 weeks before the Rivers of Blood speech, The Times said, public confidence in the ability of the leaders of the two major parties to deal with the nation's problems has reached a post-war low. So Schern argues it wasn't just the racism. A lot of it was that Powell sounded different. He challenged the post-war consensus when it was struggling. Being sacked and denounced then boosted his image as an outsider, as this sort of voice of lonely, brave, voice of dissent. He also had a populist taste for conspiracy theories and culture wars. As things got worse, basically things started to go to his head quite a lot. He accused Home Office officials of hiding the real immigration figures and lumped them in with student protesters and Ulster Catholics as the enemy within. A phrase obviously adopted by Thatcher later. The Times called it dangerous nonsense that made him the idol of the skinheads, and The Guardian dubbed him the McCarthy in our midst. Now, I don't think there's any need to attack people with shaven heads, but broadly, I agree with the point. I did not know this. I didn't really know that Powell became a conspiracy theorist and started making these very weird claims. So Schern describes Powell's targets as not just immigrants, but student demonstrators, Whitehall bureaucrats, Irish terrorists, overmighty trade unionists, and liberal do-gooders. I would add Europe becomes one of the leading no campaigners in 1975, right? Take away Irish terrorists and just sub in, Muslim terrorists. I mean, that basically is the far-right populist targets.
They're not so concerned about trade unions anymore. But
No, that's true. That's true. But as a person, he was a terrible populist. Like, he didn't have many friends. He did no grassroots organising. And he didn't spot the theme of disillusionment. He didn't exploit it like Farage does. He thought it was all about his specific ideas. So whereas Farage just gets to this idea that his appeal is things ain't right, change is needed. And then he will just kind of suddenly just go, how about I lift the 2-child benefit cap? You know, he'll go this way and that way because he realizes the core of his appeal is disillusionment. Powell did not realize that, and therefore remained very, very hardcore. And basically loads of the workers who liked the racism did not like the neoliberal economics. You know, he opposed trade unions, even though a lot of trade unions supported him. He wanted massive cuts to spending, et cetera, et cetera. And they didn't really give a shit about Europe. Like, it's funny how not asked about Europe they were. Schoen wrote in 1977, with a dangerous overdose of historical irony, except when they've been directly threatened, as in war, the English public has never been susceptible to mobilization over questions of sovereignty and nationhood.
Right.
Which at the time was true. So there are a lot of reasons why Powell could have been more dangerous.
Yes. It's almost like he lacked the requisite cynicism
and
strategic foresight, really, to properly exploit the situation that he'd created for himself. Yeah,
he just had a very, very kind of aloof, cold personality, and he didn't really understand the root of his appeal. So his last boom in popularity, as I mentioned, around 1973, it's during the wave of opposition to Ugandan Asian immigrants, Priti Patel's parents among them, basically an echo of the Kenyan Asian situation. It's a similar thing. It's a lot of people seem to come in. Immigration becomes the biggest issue in the country again. In February 1974, he quit the Tories over Europe and called on people to vote Labour. Of course, then when Labour won, he tried to take credit for their victory. Like he always thought that it was down to him. Then he became an Ulster Unionist MP until losing his seat in 1987. But whenever he lost people's attention, I noticed he returned to race. So in 1975, famously, I suppose the UK's maybe economic nadir. So this was like, stagflation. You'd recently had, 3-day week and the oil shock. Like, it's a really, really, really difficult time. He says, immigration is a problem infinitely more grave and intractable than energy or inflation or the balance of payments. I mean, completely mad and kind of politically tone deaf. He's back in rivers of blood mode after the urban riots of the early 1980s. So he claims that immigration, especially from Pakistan, would provide the bases and citadels for urban terrorism. He accused politicians of a conspiracy of silence over immigration. Then he goes, there lies the certainty, not likelihood, of violence on a scale which can only adequately be described as civil war, and proposes large-scale forced repatriation. Even Thatcher calls it a very, very alarming remark.
Oh, wow.
Because he's exploiting this urban unrest to go, okay, race war's coming, send them back. He is a full-blown conspiracy theorist now. He claimed the IRA assassinations of Lord Mountbatten and Ari Neve had been carried out by the US government and possibly MI6.
Oh, wow. No, he'd gone completely fucking absolutely batshit.
Yeah, in order to help Irish unification, I think.
Okay.
Inevitably, this is not like a terribly bad thing, but it was really inevitable that he did not believe Shakespeare wrote Shakespeare's plays and spoke quite a lot about that. It's always a little bit...
You love this one, don't you? You think it's this little litmus test.
Yeah, it's a real indicator of crankdom. Not particularly dangerous crankdom, but of a crank tendency, for sure. Foreign policy isolationist, advocate of unilateral disarmament, which is weird. He overlaps with Michael Foot on certain issues. Michael Foot weirdly was one of his few friends. I don't understand why.
No shit.
Yeah. And they agreed on sort of like unilateral disarmament. They both opposed House of Lords reform together. Quite a lot of stuff. I can't remember what Michael Foot was.
But they were mates.
Well, kind of respect.
Right.
Foot sort of had respect for him, which surprises me. But there we go. In 1993, the 25th anniversary of Rivers of Blood, he wrote a piece for The Times still predicting that there would be communal violence like that seen during the partition of India, which regular listeners will know is incredibly extreme and very unlikely in Britain. And in his last TV interview before his death in 1998, he literally said, "What's wrong with racism? Racism is the basis of a nationality. Nations are, upon the whole, united by identity with one another, the self-identification of our citizens, and that's normally due to similarities which are regarded as racial differences. It's not impossible, but it's difficult for a non-white person to be British." So what I find extraordinary, and I read quite a bit of Simon Heffer's biography of Powell, is how people were still sort of going, wow, what people don't understand about Powell. Mm-hmm. Yes, as he becomes increasingly racist. It's not just like, oh, he had a bit of a weird patch back there. Mm. He becomes more and more racist until he dies. And people are still trying to sort of cover for him and going, well, he was simply concerned about the residents of Wolverhampton. And it's like, okay, but why do you keep talking about race war in the 90s?
Well, if you're coming out to bat for this guy, who is there that you won't go out to bat for? Like, I mean, really, how hard can it be for you to just be like, no, this guy's very obviously a racist. You know, this is not a complicated moral example for us to grapple with.
Simon Heffer's book is very well researched. It's a great resource. I found it absolutely repellent.
Really?
There is nothing that he won't defend. Nothing. He'll do the whole thing. Well, what people don't understand it wasn't his words. It was Virgil's words. And like,
for fuck's sake.
You know, or they'll go, well, you know, people say he was a racist, but, you know, Indians he served with in the Second World War said he was lovely.
Oh, it's just,
I mean,
staggeringly fucking infantile.
He is a racist. He was a racist. I mean, there is no doubt about it. However he began, this is where he ended up. Now, when he died, Tony Blair said, you kind of have to say this, or do you? However much we disagreed with many of his views, there was no doubting the strength of his convictions or their sincerity or his tenacity in pursuing them, regardless of his own political self-interest.
Oh, come on. You don't need to say anything when he dies. Well, just don't say anything.
One, it was not regardless of his own political self-interest. This idea that he kind of martyred himself, and if he hadn't talked about immigration all the time, he could have been leader. The only reason he was such a popular politician was because he talked about immigration. It helped his career. On the issue of sincerity, another quote from Quentin Hogg, which is, I think, something to put almost on a mug. Some of the worst men, this is 1968, some of the worst men in the world are sincere, and the more sincere they are, the worse they are.
That is very good.
Exactly! It doesn't fucking matter whether they're sincere or not. Hitler was sincere.
Hitler was sincere. They put that on a fucking mug.
His legacy is really complicated. I don't know, suddenly, and that was a bad thing. Just so people don't have questions about your Hitler was sincere mug. So his legacy is weird, right? Because he was definitively wrong about the impossibility of integration in the imminence of race war, right? He was wrong about the thing he is most famous for. But in many ways, though, he won. He was a maverick neoliberal in the 1950s. That took over the Tory party and most of the Western world in the 80s. He was a Eurosceptic from day one. That consumed the Tories. In fact, he gloated about it in 1996. And he had the memorable line, "The nation has returned to haunt us." Which is actually, unfortunately,
It's a pretty good line. Yeah.
And he caused ripples elsewhere. Rock Against Racism was formed in 1976 because in a drunken onstage rant, Eric Clapton said Enoch was right.
Oh, gosh, yeah.
So it's sort of late Enochism led to, Rock Against Racism, push back against the National Front. That picket I mentioned at Essex University in 1968 was the start of the debate about no platforming and free speech on campuses.
Jesus God.
That's sort of where it begins. Renaud Camus, who came up with the far-right Great Replacement theory, cited Powell as an influence. Nigel Farage has, of course, said that Powell had a point. The uncomfortable question, right, is whether the British right now agrees with him on race and immigration like it agreed with him on economics and Europe. So, like we said, it has been flipped now. The average voter was much more hostile than leading politicians or editors back then. Now, it is being pushed from the top. So that seems to me like in many ways we go, oh, it's so similar, it's so similar. In that way, it seems like a massive turnaround. Your average Briton is not protesting outside a hotel with asylum seekers in it. They have friends or family members, who are in, mixed race relationships. That's their grandkids. That's their best mates. Most people, and the British Social Attitude Survey shows this, they're not racist in a Powellite way. And yet, I think the Telegraph is.
Yeah.
And Jenrick is. Suella Braverman in a very weird, fucked up way is. Farage is actually one of the people that I think is smart enough not to explicitly echo the rivers of blood speech.
One thing is also Farage is in an electoral situation where he must have succeeded at the next election, bring in more moderate centre-right voters. So it's not in he can bank those guys. You know, he needs to now appeal to a different set. So for the next 3 years, you won't hear him saying any of that stuff. That is not an indication of what he believes, nor the way that he would necessarily behave if he had any degree of executive power.
But I also think because he's a bit older, and he probably sort of grows up with that, knowing the power of the rivers of blood speech and this sort of like resonance. And maybe that makes a bit of a difference. Because a lot of the kind of real freaks that you've got around reform are like these 19-year-old Nazis, essentially. Mm. And there seems to be a sort of a distancing from all those taboos. The left will still notice it, as Keir Starmer has discovered. Use the word strangers in the wrong way, the left will notice. But I think it's sort of on the right. We talked a lot about how the firewall is down, right?
Yeah.
And therefore the taboo of rivers of blood is sort of dead. So I just want to kind of break down to finish the pillars of Powellism. What comes out of the rivers of blood speech? Play along at home next time you hear an interview with Robert Jenrick or people like that. First, the speaker claims to represent ordinary Brits who are ignored by the liberal elites and falsely accused of racism for expressing their legitimate concerns, simply saying what everyone's thinking. 2, the use of exaggerated statistics, not made up, but vastly distorted. 3, the use of alarming anecdotes about immigrants mistreating white people as if that is the normal way of things. 4, the claim that immigrants are depriving white Brits of access to schools, hospitals, and social services, often made by people who support massive cuts to public spending. And actually, Powell, early on, did make a distinction, and he was just like, I don't count people working in the NHS as immigrants. Because they're going to go home. They're not here to stay.
I see. Right.
Like, even Powell, noticed that actually we do kind of rely on people who just they don't count. I think it's for 5 now. The claim that immigrants, in fact, have more advantages due to inverse racism, making whites a persecuted minority, that's a quote, and strangers in their own country, quote. 6, the claim that Englishness is an ethnicity. Therefore, integration can't work because people of different races and cultures can never be truly English.
Yeah.
Now, I never used to hear that. I hear it a lot now. 7, a policy of net zero migration is necessary, achieved by encouraging remigration, voluntary or otherwise. 8, I didn't write down the numbers, so I'm just basically flying blind here. Let's say 8. The claim that ordinary Brits have had enough. So unless dramatic measures are taken, racial violence is inevitable and implicitly justified. Right? Which of these have you not heard in the past week?
Yeah. Yeah.
That is what is horrifying, that we've learned nothing. And I think in fact, we've got the elite, the Tory party for sure has gone backwards.
100%.
I mean, I don't think anybody could deny that. The idea that it's gone this far backwards under a black woman who grew up in Nigeria, I find insane, but that is where we are.
It's one of the most bonkers ironies that will plague history students in the future is how those two facts can go together. But those two facts have taken place together.
And what shocks me, I think, and the reason I did read out these passages at length, this is a bit long for a bonus episode, I know, is what Harold Wilson is saying, what the Times was saying, what Ted Heath was saying. Who's saying this stuff now? Who is just coming out and just going, this is morally repugnant, this is unacceptable, this is incompatible with Christian values, this is evil even.
Which is, to be fair, the kind of thing that I think David Cameron would have said. I think Theresa May would have said, despite having the most atrocious fucking record and, stimulating some really nasty thoughts within the Conservative Party, specifically on immigration, she still wouldn't have, I don't think, would have tolerated this kind of rhetoric coming out. I think she would have clamped down really hard on someone saying that you can't be English unless you're white.
Well, the difference then was like cracking down on illegal immigration, right? So it'd be like wasn't that the go home vans, right?
Yeah, she was against even legal immigration, the economic argument. She worked hard to erode some standards. No,
I'm sure, but I'm just saying, talking kind of like actively trying to deport people.
Yeah,
I mean, I think the problem with with what we assumed from the Rivers of Blood reaction, because of Ted Heath's reaction, because of the establishment's reaction, we're like, this is taboo. And it was. David Goodhart, no stranger to Powellite views, he sort of complains that Powell set back a proper debate about immigration for decades because he went so far and he made, and he established all these taboos.
I've heard Jacob Rees-Mogg made the same point, I think.
But it turns out that with those taboos gone, what you don't have is a good, decent, non-racist argument about immigration at all. And in fact, governments were, before Powell, putting restrictions on immigration. The whole, you know what I mean? It's not about, I must say, it's not really about immigration. It's not really about numbers. It's not really about jobs and housing and how many people are in which school class. It's racism. The Rivers of Blood speech, it was timed for the race relations bill, not an immigration bill. Racism is inherent there. And to me, anyone who defends Powell, it is just like the reddest of flags.
Oh, God, of course.
There is no, because I go in there, always trying to sort of understand, okay, what was he thinking? What, is there a different way of looking at this? We don't want to go in there with like just basic knee-jerk assumptions. But maybe he comes out maybe worse. And the British public of the 1960s and 70s come out really bad.
Well, but that's the one thing. So we have spent a lot of this episode saying, does anything ever change? My God, does nothing change? But as you just pointed out, the thing that does change is that public views have become infinitely more liberal and accepting and plural and embracing of a really diverse notion of what Englishness is and what Britishness is. Now, if you're in at the moment, I think it's easy to lose hope because of the velocity with which the norms are collapsing on the right and the lack of leadership figures on the left who are prepared to challenge it. But you would rather be in a debate where you've got the public with you and the elite against you than have the elite with you and the public against you. We're in a better place now than people were back then. And we have all of the kind of armaments, all of the defensive barricades with which to uphold these moral and social norms. It can be done when you have the public behind. It's much easier to have the public behind you than it is to try to win them over to your case. So one thing does change, and that's where the British public is. And that's it's a far superior place to be.
Well, so there's a few things I want to say to, I'm sure, regular listener Keir Starmer. He joined for the Starmer episode and
he certainly got the time.
He just hung around. Is that the answer? The answer is not to copy the rhetoric, and the answer is not to to think that reducing the numbers will solve anything. The answer is you're making a session, there will always be more. There are some people there that want nothing less than send them home, right? Yeah. Okay, so don't do that. Address the root cause. And this is why this Douglas Schoen book I've just found so fascinating. It was like the last book I read for research. And I was like, do I need to read this? It looks quite dry. And it's kind of amazing because it's a 70s diagnosis of populism without using the word really. So he analyzes Powell supporters. And like you said, some of them are kind of like, middle-class Tories in the Midlands. And some of them are kind of like working class East End dot workers. And, what unites all these people? He found they were more isolated and alienated, less likely to belong to organizations, more distrusting of politicians, more likely to see both parties as the same, more likely to feel powerless and unheard, and more pessimistic about the future. And he says these beliefs obviously correlate with racism, but over time, the most powerful variable was disillusionment, actually more than the racism. And that is the problem we're facing. That is the problem. That is where populism comes from. It's this feeling that things don't work. And when that happens, it just skews towards racism. And I love the idea that left-wing populism, and it will skew towards socialism. In Britain and America, it doesn't. It doesn't. It just goes towards blaming immigrants. And I think that's the kind of really deep-seated stuff. And if Labour or, any party of the centre-left thinks that you can just keep throwing bones to the anti-immigration people and that will stop them, they are wrong.
Well, thank you for joining us on another episode of Origin Story. That was, I think, definitely our longest by far Origin Story mini, which I don't think we can call anymore.
No, I don't call them minis. I call them bonus.
But
I just felt, edition. But I started working on it like weeks and weeks ago. And then it just, basically Robert Jenrick kept making it more and more relevant. And I just felt like, oh my God, I'm reading the news, and I just felt like important. I mean, are any podcasts important? Anyway, I thought that it felt like a kind of useful time to tell this story in detail.
And indeed, alas, it was. I'm Ian Dunn. That was Dorian Linsky. Guys, if you want to become Patreon supporters, you'll get access to all sorts of sort of Q&A episodes that we keep just for patrons. You'll get each episode a week early when the episodes start coming out again for our main season. We've got an absolute banger of a season coming for you very, very soon. And you also get sort of advance notices of live ticket sales and money off those tickets as well.
And it does help us. It does help us with the research. One, of course, would like to say that you would just kind of read basically read everything that I could, every contemporary book about, Powell and Rugby and stuff. I'd like to say I would do that for free because it's just important work. But it so helps. The Patreon backers, enables me to go, do you know what? I will take that extra time and go through the newspaper archives and whatever. And that's where you find a lot of the best stuff. So there is a direct correlation there between our support and just how much time we have to do this stuff.
Well, and also the podcast can only exist because of the Patreon supporters. That is the only reason that this podcast exists. Thank you very much, guys. We'll be back in a couple of weeks' time with another Origin Stories special edition. And yeah, we'll see you soon.
Cheers.